You know, nature is amazing, and the jungles are amazing. Our team goes to some of the more remote areas of the world, primarily jungles, and we have two objectives. One is education. We film extensively. We take a film team and we create educational materials from those, and those are with our nonprofit based here in High Point called Healing Seekers. And then we have an entity that does research, and that is with a for-profit, Natural Discoveries. We have a lab over at Wake Forest Innovation Quarter. The teams work amazingly well together, and the things that we have seen still to this day blow me away. Of all the species on planet Earth, if you think of all the species from the plants and the insects and the animals, the trees, the birds, the fish, and the aquatic life, we have studied extensively less than 5% of those for their medicinal value for Western medicine. But from that less than 5% of all the species on Earth, we have over 55% of our pharmaceuticals. Let me give you an idea of what these are. Blood pressure medicines called ACE inhibitors, lisinopril, Prevnar, captopril, and enalapril. The original source was from the venomous pit viper, Bothrops durarica, down in South America. And a researcher noticed that when this snake struck its prey, it caused a life-threatening plunge in blood pressure. So they went in, they looked at the venom, and they isolated a compound, and the first one they isolated was captopril. And then we have anti-diabetic drugs. Metformin, brand name is glucophage, and that comes from the French lilac plant. It's purported to be the world's most widely prescribed anti-diabetic, with over 40 million prescriptions in the USA alone. And then there's the anti-diabetic Byetta. And Byetta comes from the Gila monster, you know, the huge venomous lizards. Well, they only eat a handful of times a year, but they maintain a steady sugar insulin level. So researchers started looking at that, and they discovered a hormone in that, in its saliva. And that hormone, they called it Exendin-4. They synthetically created that, and they brought that to market as Byetta. And then there's a story like back in the 1920s, farmers in Wisconsin began to panic because their cattle were hemorrhaging. They were bleeding to death. And they finally linked the source of the bleeding to a particular batch of sweet clover. And this particular batch of sweet clover had been stored in overly dry conditions, and the overly dry conditions had facilitated the development of a mold. And that mold was preventing the blood from clotting. Well, researchers looked at that, and they worked at that for years. And they finally brought a product to market in 1948, and they sold it as rat poisoning. Well, it was always thought that it was unfit for human consumption, when in 1951, an Army abductee attempted suicide by taking it, and he lived. And it wasn't there long after that they created a form for human consumption. And today, we know that by its name, Coumadin, or by the more likely name, warfarin. Many of you have heard that. Over 80% of our antibiotics, the penicillin, cephalosporin, vancomycin, which comes from the forest floors of Borneo, to the triple antibiotic cream you're in your medicine cabinet. And Pete had mentioned the HIV, our HIV drug, AZT, comes from a sponge in the Caribbean. Less than 5% of all the species on planet Earth, and we have over 55% of our world, of our pharmaceuticals. Our world has yet to be explored. If there's not a treatment or a cure for what you're fighting right now, it does not mean that it does not exist. It just means that we haven't discovered it yet. And that is alongside these brilliant minds that are in laboratories doing things that I can't even comprehend. But the reason that we go into jungles is because that there's this outrageous amount of species of life and diversity of life. Please allow me to give you an example of how diverse these areas are in abundant, rich life forms. If you take 1/2 acre of land in central North America, and you count the number of woody plants, so those plants that are deemed woody plants, what you're going to find on average is about 20 to 30 different species of woody plants. But if you take that 1/2 acre of land in western Amazonia, what you're going to find is over 300 different species of woody plants. Well, if you imagine that 1/2 acre of land with all of those species of life, there's one thing that you can bank on, and that is competition. And there is fierce competition. These species are fighting for space, light, food, for water. They are constantly defending themselves from predators. So, for example, a plant is threatened by animals, insects, microbes, your fungus, bacteria, viruses. And a plant, if it's threatened, just can't get up and just run away. So it's developed this chemical arsenals, if you will. And these chemicals will help defend itself. Well, one of the best examples is the rosy periwinkle. And I know it's ornamental in the United States, but in its native state, which is in Madagascar, it has this ability to secrete these chemicals. And the wonderful thing is that researchers realize that those chemicals also impede certain forms of cancer. So from the rosy periwinkle, we have the vinca alkaloids, and specifically vincristine and vinblastine. They are still used today. So anyway, you have this fierce competition going on. And then you've got the mutations. So these plants and these organisms are constantly mutating, and they're changing, and they're adapting, and they're getting stronger, they're getting wiser, they're getting more clever. And they have to do that most often because they're being threatened. And if they don't change, they don't survive. Plants are no different than any other organism, and they're no different than humans. You know, we all have struggles, we all have hurdles, we all face seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But somehow we find the courage, and we find the faith, we find the hope and the strength, and somewhere along the way we shift our thinking, and we shift our attitudes, and we shift our perspectives. And for many of us, we dig deeper with our faith, and we push through it. Charles Darwin once said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, and it's not the most intelligent that survives. It's the ones that are most adaptable to change. And I would add, and it's the ones also that are the ones that actually thrive. So in the Pacific Northwest, there's a tree, and the tree is called the Pacific Yew Tree. And when loggers would come to this area, they would come in and they would log the land. And when they got to a Pacific Yew Tree, it was a nuisance. And so what they would do is they'd either cut it down and throw it off to the side, or they would just disregard it completely. Well, lo and behold, years later, scientists came along, and they found in that bark some compounds, or a compound, that killed certain cancers better than anything that they'd ever seen. But there was a problem, and it was a problem with the raw materials, with supplying enough of the raw materials. What they estimated was just to treat the people with ovarian and melanoma in the United States alone, it was going to take about 360,000 trees a year. It didn't take long to realize that that's not going to happen. I mean, the tree would become extinct in no time. So it became imperative at that point to take that miracle of nature, marry it with the brilliance of science, and create a synthetic compound. It was the only way to get that compound to the market to help others. And since then, it has helped millions of people all over the world. That compound became the drug paclitaxel, or otherwise known as Taxol, and many of you know that. The interesting thing with that is that we'd been dispensing this for years. It was on the shelf. And then they realized the compound didn't really come from the bark. The compound came from a symbiotic relationship between a microbe and the bark. So it was this tiny little organism, and this organism, when it interacted with the bark together, they created that compound that was killing the cancer cells. And I think life is like that. The most difficult challenges, the most amazing things that we accomplish in life are due to teamwork. And it seems like the right teammates always come at the right time during our lives. So 1st of August, I had a book published. And well, it took 6 years to write the book, so I don't know what that says about me as a writer. It takes me a little longer than most. But when I started writing the book, all I wanted to do was tell my favorite stories, you know, the really good, the adventures that we've had and some of these jungles throughout the world. And we got through that first draft, and at the end, and I looked at the stories, and what I realized they were some of the stories that we had the most difficult challenges and the most difficult struggles. And then I realized that those experiences, because of those difficulties and those challenges, they crafted who I was, and they created the person that I became. And because of them, I'm now able to give back to the world in ways that I never would have been able to give back had I not gone through those experiences. I also finally realized that those experiences, I was not a victim, even though I often felt like a victim. And I was not being punished, even though I often felt like I was being punished. What I finally realized was that those experiences opened doors that not only led to friendships that are some of my most dearest and most cherished in the world, they also opened my heart. And I know that several people have talked about, and George especially, about the love that you have. But I think that in life, if you have the love of friendship, you have the love of family, you have people who are beside you when you go through the good times and the bad. For me, you have a strong faith. You really are the luckiest of all. And since the group is what it is, I also wanted to say, you know, please don't ever forget that there's this huge global team of people that are working very, very hard. Some of them right here, some of them in the hospitals, researchers all around the world that are trying to make a difference in your life. So don't ever give up, and don't ever think that you're alone, because you're not. But thank you so much.
Okay.